Hey everyone, Professor Snart just checking in for our online Brit Lit course here. I just finished grading for the past unit where we were looking at really kind of an introduction to Romanticism, but specifically the work of Thomas Gray, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. I just want to say I'm really impressed with the discussion board work that people are doing, not only in terms of responding to the prompts, whether it's more of the essay style or short answer or slightly longer answer like we had for Gray's Elegy, but the effort people seem to be making to read other people's work and respond, and even responding to responses like an actual discussion is really great. It doesn't honestly take that much work, I don't think, but it just kind of enlivens the class, especially, again, that online experience can be a little disconnected for some people because you sort of post your thing, respond to somebody else's, and that constitutes discussion, which, for the most part it does, but some people have done a really good job of, checking in and responding to responses and correcting little errors they might have made, responding to more people than they necessarily needed to. So it's really great to see that, and it just makes it for such a great class experience, again, even when we're kind of working uphill in terms of being online as opposed to that face-to-face. So this discussion has been great. Both in terms of what people are posting, but also sort of how they're handling that that tool that we're using. Okay, so we get into Unit 4 now, which is British Women Romanters. I always screw this up because there's so many kind of adjectives. British Women Early Romantic Period Writers. Put those in just about any order. You get the idea. Specifically, the readings that we're looking at are Anna Letitia Barbauld's Summer Evening's Meditation and The Rights of Woman, a relatively short poem. And then the focus really for us is Mary Wollstonecraft's long essay, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Pretty famous. It certainly put her on the map, although she was a relatively famous writer at the time anyway. And this is one of those great texts where knowing the kind of social context of its production is really, really helpful. So part of the lecture notes and context is exactly that, providing kind of what was going on. But even something as simple as the fact that, her kind of engagement with the politics of the time is happening so immediately that, she can barely keep up with producing the work when the publisher wants to make it available. And questions about whether her name was attached to its original publication. It was subsequently. The issue of what her work in particular is responding to as far as other specific works or other kinds of works. So this is a great text that is really revolutionary, honestly, on its own. But to see it in that larger context, I think, brings to light even more so the degree to which Wollstonecraft was really responding to very particular kinds of ideas at her time, and those just happen to have kind of universal implication that are still with us today. So when we get to someone a little later in our course, like Virginia Woolf, the 20th century writer, we'll hear echoes of Wollstonecraft, and it's no wonder because someone like Woolf had read Wollstonecraft and was thinking very specifically when someone like Woolf is working, she's not sort of quoting or paraphrasing Wollstonecraft, but she is in that kind of vein of ideas or that sort of momentum that someone like Wollstonecraft starts, even if the styles are totally different. There's this kind of impulse that we feel carries on from Wollstonecraft's work. And remember that we're reading her, or she's writing, of course, at a time when the world and opportunities open for women and their education, which is really fundamentally what the Rights of Women is about, is just so drastically different from what we're used to. And you can argue about whether we've achieved gender equality or just exactly how unequal it is for whom and in what situations. But keep in mind that Wollstonecraft is writing at a time when female children just didn't go to school. It's not something that you did. You taught them to sew and to shut up because that's the best way to get a husband, and that's sort of your role in life. To write as dramatic an argument against that in Vindication is really pretty astounding when you think about it. Just to have the guts to do it, and to imagine that anyone would even listen, which of course they did. There were people who wanted to hear this said, just nobody had stepped up to say it. If anything, people, male writers were continuing to say the opposite, and the unit actually provides some of that background. So when you read Vindication, read it for not just those kind of big ideas it presents, but those big ideas as a direct challenge to some of the conventional wisdom of the day. It's not like Wollstonecraft's Vindication was just one of a zillion tracts that were arguing the same thing. This is one of one that's arguing the exact opposite of what so many famous and respected authors were arguing at the time. She even takes up Milton, and she does so not in a combative way, I don't think, but in a sort of corrective way, like, yeah, you got some things right, but we still need to think about this. She takes up Rousseau, again, very famous and influential at the time, and is much more combative, honestly, about that. Like, hey, man, you have some interesting things to say kind of about humanity, but when it comes to male-female, you've really got things screwed up. And in fact, that the error that keeps being committed is just compounding the problem that you're saying you're supposed to be solving. So it really is like a fairly confrontational sort of approach she takes, like not just that you're not making things better, but you're actually making things worse. You are the problem, she's saying, in the way that you would have women educated. It produces these subservient, weak, kind of conniving, all those stereotypical things. I mean, Wollstonecraft's argument is that people aren't naturally that way. They adapt to fit the social circumstance that they're in. And you, like Rousseau, or even Milton to some degree, you're causing the social situation that's producing the very kind of woman that you're all bent out of shape about. So, again, it's really kind of, I don't want to say inspirational, it sounds too corny, but it's kind of amazing to think of how, just how right Wollstonecraft seems to be, even though what she's writing is in that time period just sort of counter to conventional wisdom in so many ways. Anyway, keep that in mind. The Barbald readings are, I don't want to say secondary, but certainly the poem The Rights of Woman is more, we read as a response to Wollstonecraft's Vindication. And our textbook gives a funny footnote, something like, up until the last stanza, Barbald seems very supportive or positive about Wollstonecraft's argument. I actually read it very differently. I think Barbald, sort of intentionally or not, ends up misreading Wollstonecraft as if Wollstonecraft is saying that women should rise up and be as violent and aggressive as men have been allowed to be, and then everything will be equal, like we can be equally violent altogether. Which is, of course, not what Wollstonecraft is saying, but I think part of what Barbald does is make fun of that approach, because that poem, The Rights of Woman, is so militaristic and so kind of combative in that sense, in a way that Wollstonecraft really isn't, but Barbald presents it as such. In some ways, Barbald sets up what we call a straw man. Like, if you need something to argue against, you pretend that somebody has said something and there's this belief out there that you want to argue against, but that belief doesn't really exist. Those people didn't really say it, or not quite in that way, but it makes your argument easier if you can pretend that they did. So I think Barbald does a little bit of that. But it does show the degree to which these two respected female authors don't see eye to eye. So again, in terms of reading about gender equality, we don't want to simplify to women believe this, men believe this, and it was just this sort of war of the worlds. That's absolutely not the case. Wollstonecraft's publisher was the famous Joseph Johnson, obviously a man, and deeply committed to publishing radical ideas and revolutionary works by whoever happened to be writing them. So it's really easy to simplify these sorts of gender things. Okay, got it. The other fun thing that Wollstonecraft provides is the mother of Mary Wollstonecraft, who gives us Frankenstein. So there's this really fantastic kind of lineage that develops in terms of the literal people, but also this lineage of ideas. So we had read Milton that addresses this notion of the relationship between the creator and the created, and how does free will operate. Once the created is created, how does the creator then let that individual or those people or whatever exist on their own without meddling too much, without abandoning the creation? That very idea is picked up, of course, in Frankenstein, this notion of the creator, the created, and what happens between those two after the moment of creation. In between, we have Wollstonecraft, who has a child by Mary's William Godwin, who is himself a famous philosopher, whose kind of one of his main ideas was this notion of the perfectibility of humankind, which is an idea that was picked up by romantics like Wordsworth, for example. So remember we talked about how people like Wordsworth were so inspired initially by the American and French revolutions because they seemed to be examples of people rising beyond their station in life, of changing things, of being proactive, of wishing to achieve a greater kind of existence in the world, which is all about this Godwinian idea of infinite perfectibility, like we can always be better than what we're at, whatever that means, whether it's individually or in institutions and all that kind of stuff. We return backwards then to Milton, who was very much about the kind of hierarchy of where you're at. And while you can certainly aspire to the sort of height of that spot in the hierarchy, we really don't think beyond our certain place. And that was even more so a neoclassical idea than it was maybe specific to Milton. But that carries through then in this sort of, again, this this tradition of ideas from someone like Milton, the neoclassics against whom the romantics react, people like Wollstonecraft, who's very dependent on the idea of a reason, if we just think about this, which is a very Miltonian idea, but is clearly revolutionary in the way that so many of the romantics were. She and Godwin, William Godwin, then provide are pieces in this larger sort of contextual puzzle as far as currents of thinking that are then picked up by romantics and, of course, are expressed in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So we get this really amazing kind of web of connections that begin to develop, and that's part of what we get into here. You'll notice that the discussion board assignment is not specific to Wollstonecraft, but is actually having us investigate a little more broadly early Romantic British women writers, kind of focused, and certainly a group of authors that had been overlooked and underappreciated for a long time in academic tradition. So it's really within the last decades, to be perfectly honest, that we even pay attention to someone like Barbald or even Wollstonecraft, despite, like Milton, the massive kind of presence that she now has, and even had in her own time. She was really, not always read as part of a Brit Lit class. There was just too many other people to talk about, too many important male figures to deal with. But so we're interested then in the discussion board assignment in recovering some of those voices that really have been lost without the efforts of fairly recent, scholarly activity in the area. Okay, so lots to think about. Again, great work on the discussion board. Hopefully we can keep that up. And if you have any questions as we proceed through the course, be sure to let me know.